It's time to enhance the relationship between expertise and impact, between knowledge and application. Welcome to a journey of discovery and empowerment. Welcome to All Physicians Lead, the Forbes Books podcast that highlights the critical leadership role that all practicing physicians take on every day. Here's Dr. Leon Morse.
Today's guest is Dr. Eric Holmboe, the CEO of Intealth and a longtime leader in medical education and assessment. Before leading national organizations like the American Board of Internal Medicine, Dr. Holmboe served in the U.S. Navy, where he began shaping his approach to leadership, service, and accountability. Now at Intealth, he's focused on advancing global medical education and strengthening the connection between how we train doctors and the care patients receive. Dr. Holmboe, welcome to All Physicians Lead.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you on All Physicians Lead. Appreciate everything you've done for physician education and leadership, and we'll get a chance to talk about that here in the hour. Our listeners, I'm sure, will be very, very intrigued by your story. And typically what we do is start out just by saying, how did that story start? How'd you get interested in medicine? What was the background way back when, and what brought you on the path to where you are?
Yeah, it's always an interesting question when folks ask me, like, when did I first realize I wanted to become a physician? To be honest, it's just always something that fascinated me. I still have memories. I think I was around 11, 12 years old. Um, the Hershey Medical School had opened up as part of Penn State, and they put out a book about what it was like and what it took to become a physician. I still have these images of looking at the books and paper spread out everywhere in these photographs of medical students studying. And it's just something I always really wanted to do. And so pretty much predicated my courses in high school and college with that goal in mind.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I can't quote chapter and verse, but I've at least memorized most of William Nolan's The Making of a Surgeon, which was
There you
my
go.
influence in fifth grade.
Yeah, yeah.
That like you sort of continued to be infatuated and stayed on that pathway. Um, Early influences, you've ended up doing a ton of stuff in education and leadership, college years, medical school years. How did that influence your leadership and thoughts about where you wanted to be down the road? When did that all start?
Yeah, I think from a leadership perspective, I have to really give credit to the Navy. So I was a general medical officer for 4 years. I was stationed in Philadelphia, spent the first 2 years back and forth with the 2nd Marine Division out of Camp Lejeune, supporting various deployments and activities. And it was really there that I was introduced to several things. One was just the importance of quality improvement. So total quality management was a thing that they were teaching at the time. I had an opportunity to get some early introduction into Deming's work, which really fascinated me. We actually created a little bit of an inpatient unit at the Philadelphia Navy Hospital run by GMOs. And so with working with
Oh,
the
wow.
family medicine docs, yeah, to really take, some of the lower acuity folks and kind of manage them within the hospitals. And the other really major trigger for me as a GMO, when I was out on, some deployments, particularly I spent 5 weeks in Panama, there was no guide that a GMO had to help them with all the things they might have to do, right? Like medevacs. What do you do if somebody gets really sick and you got to, move them out of the area? And so several of us actually approached the Bureau of Medicine to say, hey, could we create kind of a GMO manual, an education manual that folks, it was portable. This is obviously pre-smartphone, so it was still on
Right. Yeah.
paper,
You got
in
to
a
carry a
little,
booklet around. Yeah.
yeah, small little
You get
notebook.
that and the Stanford guide and you're good to go. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Like for me as an intern, it's the Washington manual, the J. Stanford guide, and then we wanted to create this manual. And honestly, it was a series of events that led to a conversation with Robert Higgins, who was the Deputy Surgeon General at the time, and Jim
Mm.
Zimple, who was the
Oh,
Surgeon
yeah.
General, and they supported the project. And so that was really my first foray into thinking through an educational lens about how important that can be to support folks when they're out, doing, real world care. The next really was my residency at Yale. Got introduced to just phenomenal teachers, Was interested in this whole concept around clinical teaching, and actually it's a thing, and there's a science behind it, and you can actually get
Who knew?
better at it. Yeah, then I became a chief resident, and then that's when my interest in education really exploded. Getting to run morning report and running, teaching sessions, being and attending, and realizing that there's a lot to teaching. It's not like just having some knowledge; other things go with it. Leadership, by the way, being one of them.
Yeah, it's interesting. Our work at All Physicians League concentrates on the leadership part of the physician,
Right.
professionalism, persona, if you will. But education component of it is also very much like the leadership component, something that there is a literature, there
Yeah.
are methodologies, there are ways to improve. But for both of those things that are really core competencies for physicians, leading and teaching, we don't really dig in to the depth that we do with, cognitive knowledge and technical
Yep.
skills in medical education from medical school through residency and maintenance and certification and beyond.
Right.
H- How do those two, that concept of, we do these things naturally and we do a pretty good job, I think, but gosh, we could sure do better if we had some foundational knowledge and ongoing assessment and improvement.
Yeah, no, I think they're actually really important. I mean, obviously, there's this assumption that because if you acquire a lot of knowledge and skills, that automatically translates into being a good teacher. And in that case, same with leadership, right? And it's really they're both incredibly important skills, and there are ways of getting better at it that aren't necessarily formalized. At least it wasn't when I first started out. I mean, I was fortunate, for example, to encounter when I went back out of my residency. I was then stationed at the National Hospital in Portsmouth, sorry, Naval Hospital in Portsmouth. And that's where I met Lou Pangaro. And so Lou Pangaro, who became the chair of medicine, I was a clerkship director with Lou. And so Lou introduced me not only to his kind of model of evaluation and assessment called RHIME, but also introduced me to clinical teaching seminars that had been developed by Kelly Skeff out at Stanford. And so that was really my first introduction in a formal way to the science behind teaching, if you will. And then I would get to spend a whole month at Stanford actually taking the training with Kelly Skeff and Georgette Stratos. And I'll just tell you a funny story. So I remember I'm finishing my first week, and of course, there's all kinds of reading that comes with it, and there's a lot of skill practice. It was very hands-on. And I'm talking to my roommate that I spent the month with to go like, huh, who knew there's actually a science behind education, right? There's all this stuff that goes with it. And so that was just like such an aha moment that, like all things like leadership, teaching, there is a science behind it. Oh, by the way, you can actually get better at it. There's
Yeah.
training and techniques to help you get better. And so that was very revelatory for me.
And, if you look at the bell curve of teachers, educators in medicine, you look at the bell curve of leaders in medicine, it's pretty wide. I mean, there are some folks that have either had background in it or just have naturally become better or have read on their own sort of
Right.
self-directed
Self-directed type learning. Yeah.
learning, and they're pretty good. And then there are some folks, whether it's the leadership domain or the teaching domain, that really could use, a lot of work. We talk a lot about unwarranted variation in
Right.
care, whether it's, days on a ventilator or antibiotic usage. But one of the things I'm trying to get folks to talk about is the unnecessary, unwarranted variation in leadership skills, and not just narrowing that bell curve, but also sort of shifting it to the
Yeah.
positive
No, I
with some
completely agree with
really
that.
fundamental work.
It is fundamental work, and so like you, I'm a huge fan of Jack Wenberg's work, right? The idea of
Mhm.
warranted versus unwarranted variation, and I think over the last, literally 50 years since Jack began his work in the 70s and others have taken it up, we've certainly seen a lot more attention to that concept and, around clinical care. But the same principles apply to everything that you just said, whether it be assessing learners, the leadership working with an interprofessional team and delivering care, engaging in quality improvement and patient safety initiatives. That variation plays a huge role And I've always been struck in medical education. I love your thoughts on this, is that to some extent, we've kind of embraced variation as always a good thing. So, in other words, like, well, at our medical school, we do it this way, and we're really proud that we do it differently. And that may be fine. It may be that it's a warranted form of variation, but I would at least like folks to ask the question, is it? Right? Just
Yeah.
because we've done it this way for such a long period of time, maybe it isn't the best way to do it. I'll give you a personal example where this came up. So when I was at Yale, after leaving the National Naval Medical Center in 2000, I became the kind of the director for student assessment, and we were getting ready for the first clinical skills exam from the United States Medical Licensing Exam. Right, the Step 2 clinical skills was just starting, 2004. And so we thought, well, we should get our students ready and we should have them go through an initial experience with standardized patients. But Yale did not have a standardized patient lab at that time. So we use UConn, University of Connecticut. They were terrific, very kind,
Oh, nice.
accommodating, and they worked with us. But what was interesting about that experience is that when we got the results, yeah, things didn't go so well. There were all kinds of challenges, particularly in physical exam skills and some of the communication skills. And it really took the faculty aback because, as you can imagine, these are really smart, young adults working toward a medical degree. That not knowledge was not the issue. It was all the
Right.
other stuff that they were kind of struggling with. And so the good news is it kind of opened up the lid to say, like, the way that they were doing things just wasn't, as effective as they thought it was, right? There was so much variation, it turned out, and how the faculty were teaching clinical
Mhm.
skills that it led to the predictable result that you would see wide variation in performance on something like an OSCE or standardized patient exam.
Yeah, you bet. And take that to a whole nother level when you think about teaching skills or leadership skills
Yeah.
in which there's virtually no faculty input improving students and residents during their journey in those two domains. So that, logically would even increase that variability
Yeah, no,
more.
absolutely. I mean, I think during my time, again, credit to Kelly, Skeff, and Georgette Stratos that they did develop a clinical teaching series for residents. So at least there was something in the 90s, if you will, that was being deployed in those who participated. But I got to agree with you. Like, I remember becoming a chief resident or I became a division director. There was no leadership training specifically designed for
That's
that. It
right.
was really kind of catch as catch can. And so at that time, the concept of leadership training, I can't recall anything specific. A little bit of progress in teaching. The only real connection I had around leadership training, I have to thank the Navy for. It
Right.
certainly wasn't happening when I was in, the civilian sector during that time.
Yeah, and it's fascinating that if you think about our current connotation of a physician leader, you ask 100 doctors to name a physician leader, they're going to name a medical director, a chief, a chair, a dean, maybe a CEO if they have one, a
Right.
CMO. Those are physician leaders. So you don't need to learn that as a medical student and a resident because it's going to be years down the road before you actually become a leader. When in fact, you're leading all the time as a frontline physician,
Yeah.
whether you're getting a patient to stop smoking, lose weight, take their medicine, that's leading. If you're in the OR, the trauma bay, the ICU, running a code, I mean, those are all leadership events and the leader behaviors matter.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I appreciate you send me your book. I haven't had a chance to read all of it, but I was really
Oh,
struck
thanks.
by
Happy to send it.
reading the first couple chapters, your real emphasis on those other skills, particularly things like communication. How do you manage conflict, right? When there is a difficult situation, I was struck by the examples you provide, and like there's an effective way to handle when, really difficult or bad things happen and not so effective ways, right? And so those are leadership skills. When those sort of things happen, folks look to leaders to help them through those, kind of difficult events. And then, as you point out, there's the day to day stuff where you're working with your team, you're working with patients to help, guide them in partnership, to, hopefully better outcomes, more effective practices that lead to better quality of life. The other thing that your comment just triggered around leadership, being so titular, right, based on title instead of like, the functions. I was fortunate to be part of a study with Harlan Krumholtz at Yale, who's done tremendous work improving the quality of care with his teams around cardiovascular disease. And so one of the studies we were involved with was looking at what distinguished hospitals that have been really successful in improving, for example, just giving a beta blocker discharge
Oh,
or
right.
improving the door to balloon time. And one of them, won't surprise you, is that they had an effective a physician opinion leader, somebody who was engaged, working with the teams, you know, using the data, being transparent and honest about where they were and where they needed to go. And one of the things that really struck me about that study, that I was involved in, is that when we looked at the characteristics of what really distinguished an effective opinion leader versus one that wasn't, was they were much more likely to volunteer their time, right? Not expect to be compensated for it. And second,
Oh,
had
right.
really good communication skills, right? They were able to work through these difficult challenges because they had such good interprofessional teamwork skills and communication. So I don't think that would surprise you.
Yeah. No, not at all. And there's good data across industries that shows that it's the frontline leaders, not necessarily the CEOs, that really make a difference in our business, the environment of care, but the
Yeah.
production line, improved retention, improved team member engagement, decreased error rates, all the things you want to see in your high performing healthcare teams, whether it's in the clinic, the hospital, the OR, the ED, you name it. That's the kind of thing you want to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Are you familiar with Paul Tolman's work in microsystems theory?
I'll have to look it up.
Yeah, so this is something I think really resonates with what you just said. So Paul and the team at Dartmouth really came up with this concept building on the work of others around the microsystems. And the microsystems is actually where the care occurs. Oftentimes they're geographically located, so to speak. Like, so for you as a surgeon, it would be the operating theater. That's a microsystem, right? With all the various people that are working within that, or might be an emergency department or radiology suite. Um, but as he points out, that's the coal face of where care is occurring, and the leadership at that layer, the microsystems, really important. The other parts of an institution, what he calls the mesosystems, like the quality improvement department, HR, the various other functions, they should be in support of those frontline units. And then the kind of quote senior titular leaders that you talked about, the CEO, the CMO, and so forth, their job is to support those frontline units and make sure the folks working in those microsystems really have the resources, the skills, the leadership capabilities in order to deliver the care. Because as you point out, that's actually where it's occurring. It's not occurring in the
Right.
C-suite, right? It's occurring in those areas.
Yeah, I think I only half joked that when I was a CEO of a big healthcare,
Right, yeah,
medical
that's
group in
right.
our system that they, I think half the team just had my name on batch delete. It just went straight to their spam folder. So, my impact on the environment of care as a CEO is very different than our 1,100 physicians and 400 APPs who are there every minute,
Yeah,
and their behaviors have impact and they have influence
yep.
on the entire milieu, to a much greater degree than the C-suite ever can.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, I totally agree, and I think that the C-suite is really has to be, setting the direction right, thinking strategically, role modeling, good behavior, making sure folks have resources, but also making sure that we all try to stay accountable to what our ultimate outcomes are, and that's just better patient care and better patient outcomes.
So, tons of work that you and others since have done on the competencies. We'll go to something that, I'm sure all of our listeners will relate to, and many, 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 if not all, know that you had a founding hand in all that. Tell us how that became about. What was your role? How do you lead through that type of change that really created an umbrella over, all of US GME and internationally, really?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting. So in the early days of the competency movement, as you and your listeners may know, that they were formally approved by the American Board of Medical Specialties and the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education in February of 1999. The reason I know that is Paul Batalden was one of the leaders of that work, um, in trying to develop those. And to Paul's credit, he brought in healthcare leaders that are leading systems, got the patient voice. It was very much a process that got all the different lenses into that. And it's part of the reason why you saw practice-based learning and improvement, systems-based practice become two of the newest competencies, right? Which are heavily grounded in leadership skills. And so I had just gone back to Yale at that time and became an associate program director working in the Yale primary care program. We had to quote implement these competencies. And so we had this kind of framework, but nobody really knew like what that looked like with regard to curriculum, assessment and so forth. My One of my major research interests at the time was in assessment. So it was really trying to think about how do we make sure that we're assessing in a way that not only covers the six general competencies, but really contributes to professional development. We have tended to think so dichotomously, right? Pass a test, fail a test, right? The kind of thumbs up, thumbs down type process without recognizing that becoming a physician or frankly any health professional is an incredibly and intensely developmental process. And so that was kind of my early
And
phase,
never
and
stops,
then I
right?
got
Yeah,
recruit
never stops.
Yeah, and it never stops. I mean, I think if you look at there's this kind of interesting it's not a paradox, but it's a really interesting phenomenon, and I'm willing to bet you as a pediatric neurosurgeon probably experienced this, that when you're in your training program, the amount of change that you undergo in a short period of time is profound, right? I mean, you learn a lot in such a
So
short
true.
period of time relative to a career. But that journey to mastery and expertise, it requires a lot of hard work, right? It's constantly looking to how you get better. And to me, that's also a leadership skill, right? Owning the fact that you're not done. You're coming out, you may be very well prepared, but if you truly want to be the master clinician or the master leader, you've got work to do. And that is a developmental journey that never stops.
Yeah, so very true. And try to emphasize that also in leader development. When I get a chance to get in front of audiences and talk about that, I say
Right.
I'm, almost 64 years old and I am still learning. I pick up things all the time, in part because I've encouraged people to point them out to me, but also because I'm reflecting on that competency with the intent to improve all the time. One of the best examples I use is, you walk into you're coming to clinic in the morning and you are late, a few minutes late, traffic, whatever. It's raining. Your car key doesn't work in the garage. Now you got to park in surface parking. So now you're even later. It's raining. You don't have an umbrella because you park in a
Yeah.
garage. You walk in a clinic, you're soaking wet. You're late. There's three patients waiting for you already.
Yep.
And the clinic administrator opens the door and says, "Hey, Dr. Moores, how you doing?" And you're just like, ah, yeah. And then
Yeah.
if you recognize that you're a leader in that environment and that your actions have impact,
Yep.
you'll reflect on that and at the very least say, "Oh my gosh, I need to do better next time." You'll probably loop back and apologize and mend some fences there, but you'll also recognize that other people in your clinic probably witnessed that encounter. Now, that day and days going forward, how likely do you think they're going to be to come up to you and say, "Hey, Dr. Morris, this patient's like 30 minutes late. Can you still squeeze him in?" You've just shut down communication,
Yeah.
you know, at least fivefold for everyone that saw you explode. And, going back and talking to them and saying, "No, no, no, I'm okay. Let's all be okay and move forward." But if you're not thinking that you're a leader, you're just one of the team. You're not going to go through those steps, which I think are critically important to continuing to improve.
Yeah, I completely agree. I resonate with your example, having unfortunately probably done that a few times. Like, I think back to,
Well, we're
the
human, right? We all
yeah, I know
do.
it's a very human thing, but I think you also bring up a couple other things that are really critically important. That if you don't address it, with your team, then what you said is likely to happen, right? You've now decreased psychological safety for folks to approach you. And
Big
particularly
time.
if you're a leader that does have a title, right, just by default, your quote psychological size may already be getting in the way of them needing to share things with you. And so you've always got to take that into account. The other thing that I really appreciate about what you just said is I think one of the most important phrases in the human language is I'm sorry, right? Not my best moment. Listen, I want to talk to you about it. I want to make sure that, moving forward that we continue to work and, I own the fact that, I could have handled that better and let's figure out, how to continue to move forward. I think that's so important because if you don't, to your point, then what you just described is going to happen. And the more those sort of events happen, where you're not doing the best role modeling and you're not taking your own personal accountability for it, which I think is a huge leadership skill, right? Your own personal accountability, the ability to self reflect, engage in reflective practice. You're going to make it harder and harder for folks to have honest conversations with you down the road.
Yeah. Yeah. And to me, it all starts with saying, I'm a leader. And it doesn't mean that physicians are all that or even we're the boss.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah.
just that you, and we all do, we all have impact. We all have influence. So really all people are leading pretty much every encounter all day long.
Yeah.
Um, but obviously I focus on physicians because I can say uncomfortable things about them and get away with it. So, yeah,
There you
uh,
go.
about us, not them, about
Yeah,
us and
no,
get
it's
away
right.
with
It's
it
part of
because
that
we like
self-reflection,
you
right?
said,
We as a
we've all done it.
profession. Yeah.
So and that your comment about I'm sorry reminded me of the old line that the three most difficult things to say in the English language are I love you, I'm sorry, and Worcestershire sauce.
Oh, I like that. I'm gonna have to use that. Yeah, I'm not even gonna try to say it. Yeah, I'm gonna
Kind
let
of
that one
funny.
go.
Yeah. If you're in Boston, it's just Worcester. You just eliminate all the syllables.
Yeah, my sister lives in Natick. I'll have to run that by her. And
See what she thinks.
yeah,
See what
exactly.
she
Yeah.
thinks. Um, one of the jokes about economists is that an economist will take something that's happening in reality and then demonstrate why it doesn't work in theory. Um, and when we talk about fuzzy things like leadership and educational talent, how do you link up scientific rigor and in the teaching education space with the real world that is fuzzy and people are quote good teachers and bad teachers or better teachers and excellent teachers and studying that, putting some science behind it.
Right.
Tell us about that linkage. How does that work?
Yeah, so I think that's another really important concept that and it gets back to a little bit what I said earlier about like, we only use dichotomous thinking, right? Or linear thinking. It gets us into trouble. This is where complexity of thinking is really important because you have to be prepared that things are going to happen that you weren't necessarily expecting that day. As you know better than I, being a West Point grad, that one of the things they teach in the military is that it's very important to plan, train, and be as prepared as you can be, but no battle plan survives contact with the enemy. It just
That's right.
doesn't. And so that is part of the training is understanding the adaptability, flexibility, and problem solving in real time and understanding the context in which you work. And so if you don't understand the context, if you just blindly always apply the same rules and expect them to always work, you're probably going to be really disappointed because sooner or later something's going to come in and that's where you have to have the adaptability skills, right? And also as a leader, help your team in that moment when things are headed south, right? That's where leaders really become important. Like if things are working fine and kind of running along, you know, leadership is really more in kind of the interactional piece to make sure that the best care and stuff. But there's going to be times when things are just falling apart, not unlike what you described, not falling apart, but in your clinic, something happened to start the day, you're already behind. What adaptations are you going to need to make during that day? That's a minor example. I'm thinking of your example from your book and what happened and the differences, between one situation and the OR and another. When bad things happen that you didn't expect. How do you manage that, right? And that's the context and the complexity aspect. And I really think that for leaders, and I don't care if you're just shouldn't say just, if you're a frontline leader, right? You're, somebody who's a CEO like you were, you have to understand systems thinking. That to me is such a critical leadership skill. If you don't understand how systems work and the interdependencies that occur in running and working in systems, I think you're going to struggle.
Yeah. And honestly, even in the front lines positions, it helps as the physician leader of a team when, new EMR requirements are coming down and new billing and coding requirements are coming down and, more regulatory requirements are coming down. One leader can sit there and just kvetch and, and everybody kind of gets depressed because of it. Another might say, hey, none of us like these, but A, we need to do them. B, the healthcare system that we're in needs to stay solvent or nobody's going to get care.
Right.
And these are some of the tools that folks in the C-suite and throughout the organization have to use to make sure that happens. And I know those people, and they're very good, very dedicated, very caring folks because they could probably make more money outside healthcare, but they're in healthcare because they care about patients, they care
Yeah.
about the mission, just like we do. So none of us like it. They don't like pushing them down on top of us every day either. I'll be honest with that. It's not something that, uh, but that's a very, very different message. And it's not that you're, going belly up and saying, oh, just whatever. I'm in the Skinner box and I'm just getting shocked. Um,
I like the
but
metaphor. Yeah.
all right. And but you're sort of rallying the team against the um, not the enemy, but the vicissitudes of daily work and reorienting them to the fact that we're making difference in people's lives.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Like we're all going to encounter challenges, and it's interesting how difficult change is just for all of us as humans, but we've known that it's been difficult, forever. I always Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher in 2000 BC, I think it was, who said the only constant is change, right? And the way
Indeed.
he phrased it as a philosopher is no man steps into the same stream twice, right? Things are
Yeah.
always flowing and changing. And so I think that's the reality in helping folks manage that. Like you said, having worked with a number of CEOs hospitals when I was in my educational space, they want to do the right thing too, and they're
Yes.
dealing with realities. And so I'll just give you one example from my military time and always sticks with me. Bonnie Potter was the commanding officer of the National Medical Center. This is back in 1998. And
Know her well.
yeah, and so Bonnie was given this directive to start using chronic disease management within the hospital to try to reduce costs and emissions and so forth. There's something called the Wagner chronic care model to come out of Seattle at the time. So Bonnie calls me into her office to say, listen, I really want you to lead this. My first reaction would be like, oh, one more thing I got to do. But then she gave me the greatest gift of all time. She said the following, and I'm paraphrasing obviously at this point, but she said, listen, I don't have any extra money to give you. Right? We've got a limited amount of funds. We're gonna try this. The hospital wants this, or the Navy wants us to do that. Then she said, but you can do anything you want with your clinic to make this work. Right.
Oh, nice.
And so basically she allowed me to redesign the delivery model within the clinic, right? Gave me the flexibility to rethink how we deliver care. And it ended up being one of the best experiences of my life. And again, that was that flexibility. So like, yeah, not fun. I know this is extra work, but you know what? Innovate, try something different, see
Yeah.
what you can do. And so we ended up creating a chronic disease management program for diabetes that made a real impact on folks' lives. And by the way, it wasn't because of me. it was really because of the team, that really assembled around this and started doing just amazing things. The corpsman, we had a case manager, still remember her name, Rose Escobedo, who did amazing things working with these diabetic patients who were struggling. And it still sticks with me because that adaptability, thinking differently through a systems, having the permission to try stuff, but also to fail, right? Like not everything we put into place early on worked. I can tell you a couple of days were pretty rough, but also
Sure.
the kind of belief that we can make this better. And that took leadership on the part of everybody to make that happen.
Yeah, I mean, and a great example from Admiral Potter, right, is the idea that the people that are far forward are probably going to be able to figure out the best way to implement this. So send that out to the people, your case manager, as a great
Yeah.
example of a huge complexity of that, multi-system, really complex, predominantly outpatient management
Right.
falls to the case management teams. And so pushing that down and saying, hey, what do you think is the best way to do it is something that doesn't necessarily come naturally to doctors
No.
because we're supposed to have the answer. You go through
Exactly.
all
The
our
sage
training
on
and
the stage kind of problem.
you're pimped on rounds as a
Yep.
medical student and a resident. You're expected to have the answer. And I recall a great statement when I was at the War College here in town, that when you go from being a tactical leader to a strategic leader, you're no longer expected to have the right answer because everyone that's briefing you is probably going to know more about their stuff than you ever will.
Exactly.
Um, but you have to know how to ask the right questions.
Right.
And, that becomes so important for leaders today as medicine becomes more and more and more complex.
Yeah.
When I step into the OR or the ICU, if there's 5 or 6 people in there, there's probably between 50 and 100 years of aggregate healthcare experience in that room,
Yep.
right? Not including me. And
Yeah.
to ignore that, the value of that experience and expertise doesn't allow you to make the best decisions for any means.
Yeah, and it's not in the best interest of patients, right? Is you and I, talked about earlier, and it also triggered another thought about something else that's really intrigued me over the last 10 years is this concept of co-production, where you co-produce change or you co-produce a better outcome in partnership with the folks you just talked about who bring this lived experience and this expertise. There's this other concept I find really helpful in thinking about that is called distributed cognition. And so the idea that there are pockets of expertise that are distributed and you don't own all of it, right? For
That's
all
right.
the reasons
You
you
might
just
not
said.
even know where they are
Exactly, and so as a
in the
leader,
theory,
you
right?
have to keep that in mind as like and recognize like, I really don't have an answer here, but it's my responsibility as a leader to go find it, right? Or to
Yes.
work with individuals who can be helpful in this situation, who have the knowledge, skills, and attitudes needed in this particular situation. I mean, it's a little bit akin, I think it was Blanchard, right? Kenneth Blanchard, the concept of situational leadership, understanding the situation you're in and then leveraging your expertise, that distributed expertise that exists within your system.
Right. Yeah, and as I sort of touched on it because it's not uncommon for me to have experienced, and I kind of take a rolled up newspaper and just whack people on the nose when I hear them doing it. Um, is is the stay in your lane. Someone will make a comment. It's like, hey, that's not your lane.
Yeah.
That's not your area of expertise. But that completely ignores the fact that you may not know where the next great idea is coming from. So don't assume that it's not going to come from someone in marketing who's talking about your strategy
Right.
or someone in, finance that's talking about your logistics. It's like, hey, there's all kinds of thought that's possible here. Throw it all on the table and then, leader, you make the decision, but don't discount anyone, and particularly someone who's, speaking up maybe outside their comfort zone. I mean, encourage that, right?
Yeah, there's actually some really interesting research on kind of group process. I had the good fortune to work with David Berg again at at Yale who wrote a book called The Paradoxes of Group Life and how important group process is. And then James Surowiecki wrote a really interesting book, kind of collating in layman's term, like what the research showed. But at the end of the day, it really highlighted what you just said, how important it is to listen to all opinions. And the other thing that's been found in that work is even if it turns out that minority opinion's wrong, it's still helpful because it forces you to at least take a step back and think, "Whoa, wait a minute. Am I missing something here? Maybe
Yeah,
this
that's
this
great.
input may have some value." And so many times there may be a kernel in there that's useful, but even if it's wrong, the work has shown is it forces you to recalibrate and at least reconsider in a way that could be helpful, even if it turns out you're not going to go in that direction. But it was helpful to make sure that you consider all the possibilities, alternatives to a situation.
Yeah. No, and that's great. And that implies that one of the key aspects, I think, of leadership is active listening so that,
Yes.
you're somebody says that and you're not automatically, shutting it down in your mind or, dumb idea, even if you don't say that you actually do go through that mental process of saying, well, that's interesting. Let me think about that. That's a lens that I don't have. And
Yep.
let's work through it either individually or as a group. Yeah. That's
Yeah, I mean, the active listening is such an important skill, right? Yet another leadership skill that I know that's near and dear to your heart. And it's like the old adage, like there's a reason God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth, right?
I don't know how many times a year I use that in talk. So yeah, I
But
appreciate
I
it.
think it's a really
Hmm.
useful thing, right? It's so easy,
It is.
particularly if you're in a position of power, right? Either due to, your title or your position or your training to wanna jump in and discount things quickly. And so, like you said, having the self-awareness to say, "Well, let's take a step back, listen to what's coming in, and process it first before jumping to a conclusion."
Yeah. And the other thing that we get faced with just on a tactical level is we're all very busy, right?
Right.
So um, i- i- it's often easy to hear something and just move along without really processing it,
Right.
um, or to just shut down discussion because you're busy.
Yep.
Or probably the worst of those scenarios is you're in a room, you look like you're listening, but you're actually focused on the meeting before or the meeting after because you're so busy
Right.
that you haven't cleared your mind to be present, yet people think you're there.
Yeah.
So as a leader, that's a huge problematic trap is, people assume that you're hearing what they're saying. And if you're thinking about, the budget and you're in a, logistics meeting, then well, those are tied together, obviously, but you get the idea. Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah,
no, I
no,
think that's
don't worry about the
important.
budget. Let's just talk about how much stuff we're gonna buy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think that's also another really important point because, as you point out, we really are so busy, and many times, particularly if you do have a certain role, you're asked to wear a lot of different hats at different time during the day. One technique that we try to use, and to be honest, I think it probably has some variable success, but I learned it some years ago from Tony Suckman and Penny Williamson. They ran a course called Leading Organizations to Health, and they actually have taken
Mm.
that program, and it's now housed at the Association or American Association of Medical Colleges (AAMC). And what they recommend is do something called a check-in. And so at the beginning of the meeting, you literally ask, "Is there anything folks would like to share that might keep them from being fully present for this meeting?"
Yeah,
And and
it's a
and
nice
again, it's
technique.
it's a little technique, nothing's ever perfect, but to your point, that's another kind of thing leaders can do to role models so that they're, trying to get folks to be fully present when you're gonna be talking about important things. And these are little tips and, tricks of the trade that all leaders can use, right, when they're running a meeting or they're gonna talk about something important.
That's right, yeah, and just the emphasis that you're gonna take, 5, 7 minutes to go around the table and say, "This is what's gonna help me be present. This is what's gonna help me be present. This is what's gonna help me be present."
Yeah.
That repetition, really makes it sink in.
And it
Yeah,
actually
all
ends
right.
up being more efficient because, like you said, if folks are disconnected or they're distracted, right?
Mhm.
Then the meetings are not going to be as effective. And so you may end up having to have yet another meeting, or, like you said, you don't come to conclusion at the end of that meeting on what needs to be done next and so forth. And so, I just find these little, it seems small, but, they actually create efficiencies if you can do them well.
That's right. That's right. I'm going to take a turn here because this is something that Lisa and I talk a lot about. She's, as you may be aware, she's the associate dean for assessment, and created that office and made it programmatic at USU after she
Yeah.
retired as the dean of students. So I've watched her, transition. She felt, which she's brilliant, as you and I both know.
Yes.
And I had no doubt that she would succeed, but she said, "This is total imposter syndrome. I've never studied assessment. I
Oh,
don't
yeah.
know, anything about it." But she was obviously doing assessment and teaching in her whole career.
Right.
In any case, one of the things that we talk about after, maybe a glass or two of wine, I go off on this tangent that, if I'm at Ford Motor Company or I'm at Boeing, I have very specific outcome measures for each widget I'm producing.
Right.
Whether that's a blade or vane for a jet engine, or a certain airspeed and fuel efficiency, or crash resistance for this vehicle, number of passengers, weight. It's highly, highly specified,
Yes.
what the product is, and in comparison with other products, where they rank in terms of
Yep.
quality. Safety's a component of quality. I I I kind of poke at her and I go, "Well, you're doing these assessments, but you don't know what the optimal outcome measure is,
Yep.
because how do we define a good doctor? What is the gold standard for the product?"
Yep.
Um, so I throw that out to you kind of cold. You've probably kind of gone back and forth on it, but is it the person who, gets the highest board score in their orthopedic residency? Is it, the number of chairmen that you produce, the ones that make the most money, the ones that have the least malpractice, the ones that publish the most papers? There's so many good things that doctors do,
Right.
but if you've got this medical school curriculum and then this residency curriculum to build a product, but we have a hard time defining what an A plus product versus a B product versus a C level product is as a doctor. How do you define good doctor?
Yeah, well, I think that's actually been a major focus of the work literally for 20 plus years now. And so it is still far from perfect. But I think at the end of the day, we want to make sure that physicians have the requisite competencies to maximize the probability of a good outcome for their patients. And we now have better ways of measuring that. Again, far from perfect. We can certainly measure complication rates. We now have better measures, for example, around functional status. PROMs, I think, have been really helpful, patient reported outcome measures. These are all things that
Yeah.
we can use, and we're still making progress. What I think has been helpful because of the competencies, that initial kind of framework then led to work around something called competency milestones, which I spent a fair of my time over the last 10 years working in, where we now are working to define what does somebody look like and what can they do when they've reached a level of development that they can now practice without further supervision. Again, going back to what we talked about earlier, but they're not done. So in using the kind of Dreyfus language, they're proficient, right? They provide high quality, good care, but they're still working toward mastery, and they will need to continue that journey, including seeking out guidance from the more senior mentors to help them continually get better and so forth. So we have a much better description now. And there is research that have now correlated performance on those milestones with early practice outcomes. One study was done by Bridget Smith, looking at the kind of performance that's judged by the milestones, and then looking at complication rates in vascular surgery in the first 3 years of practice.
Oh, wow.
And
I didn't
so
see
it's
that. Yeah.
really interesting to see the correlation. It's not so much, and to me, the importance of that that work, Leon, is not that like, oh, it shows that there's some validity evidence from the milestones. That's not the point. The point is we now have a signal that we can feed back into the training programs that if you see these patterns of performance using more of a programmatic assessment approach, not just a test, right, to get your earlier point, but really looking across the 6 general competencies, that this is going to have some predictive value in like how they're going to perform in early practice. And so instead of like leaving it to chance, intervene during their training program. We are getting much closer to being able to do that. Surgery, by the way, particularly because of the work of American Board of Surgery, Brian George and other University of Michigan, and so forth, they have really developed pretty amazing systems to look at developmental trajectories when somebody's really demonstrated they're ready for graduation. So we've made a lot of progress in that area, but it also is very messy work. It is easy to measure how many multiple choice questions you answer,
Yes.
and that science is well developed. I don't want to discount it. I worked at a certification board for 9 years, but it really gets back to all the other stuff you and I have been talking about that, yes, that's essential but insufficient. It's all of these other skills, including leadership skills, that are critical to maximize the outcomes for patients, but also, maximize educational outcomes. And so that focus that was really accelerated the last 10 years honestly gives me a lot of hope that we've really reached an important inflection point where we can move that forward in a more systematic and effective way.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. One of the things that, you and I are familiar with from the military is the emphasis on leader education, development,
Yeah.
assessment, training. And um, when I talk to audiences about implementing this either at an individual level or at an organizational level, the advantages that we have are we pretty much know how to teach in medicine. We can do better, right?
Right.
We
Sure.
we know how to build curriculum. We're familiar with how to do assessments. This is just leadership development. Really, is just putting different content into the models that we already use. And as an example, as a pretty straightforward example, when we're at the scrub sink and getting ready to start the next case, and the resident's standing here, we very routinely talk about the natural history of the disease. And if you get into trouble at this point in the case, what do you think you should do?
Right.
Do we need fluoro to start this case? All these technical aspects of the case, but it's also something that I'll, try to do frequently and say, oh, and in the last case when, we sort of dropped a handoff and the instrument fell on the floor, you handled that really well. You just said to the scrub tech, "Oh, don't worry about it. I can use this one. Let's see if we can get another one up." That was really potentially a stressful moment, potentially a flashpoint
Right.
that you did very well. You demonstrated very good leadership. You kept the team calm because everyone kind of went, and they were waiting for the leader's
Right.
response, and you handled it beautifully.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of things that we can do if we're paying attention to the fact that physician leadership matters, just as part of the routine. Not unlike when I was an infantry platoon leader and the company commander would pull me aside and say, "Hey, blah 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 blah," not just tactical stuff, but also leadership stuff.
Yeah, it's almost, I think, analogous to this concept of micro skills, right? Like in those moments, those micro leadership skills are so important. And the other thing that I think your example highlights is the importance of emotional intelligence among leaders, right? Yeah, because you could have gone off on that resident and gotten berated
Mhm.
them, but instead you didn't. And the resident also handled it really well by not berating somebody else. Like, we're a team, we got to adapt. Something's happened. Let's make those adjustments. And that's what happened. But that took insight, this kind of that micro skill that you talked about in the moment. And it also took emotional intelligence to recognize that berating somebody at that point, it really wasn't gonna help anybody, including the patient.
Right. Yeah, one of my favorite examples, and having both seen it but also seen the movie a number of times, is the Apollo 13
Oh, yeah.
mission where, ship is going through space and blows up.
Yep.
Right? So ship is blowing up, right?
Literally.
And imminent death, almost undoubtedly, for the crew, who the commander is really responsible for and feels that all commanders do. So you and your crew are about to die, and what does Jim Lovell do? He picks up the microphone. He says, "Houston, we have a problem."
Yep.
Just like that, right? Okay,
Yeah.
let's.
And then
Here
started
we
to work
are.
the problem, right? And even when they're starting
Let's
to get
go
tension
forward.
within the capsule, he basically says, We're not gonna bounce off the walls. We're not gonna do this, right? We're gonna work this together and we're gonna solve it." Because, there was that scene where, they were upset about, like, what caused the explosion. I just stirred the tanks. And
Yeah,
yet he had the wherewithal to say, like, "That's not gonna help us at this point, right? Whatever happened, happened. We'll sort that out later. Let's deal with what's in front of us right now."
yeah, yep. No, it's good, great leadership lessons in that
Yeah, very much
particular
so.
movie. Um, so one of the questions that folks frequently have when looking at someone in your distinguished career and
Oh,
doing
you're
so
being
many
too
things
kind,
so
thanks.
so well is how do you do so many things so well? Where is the what's the methodology? What did you do to say, wow, I'm going to be a great doctor, I'm going to be a great leader, I'm going to be a great educator, I'm going to do all these things? How does that progression work, and how do you maintain skills in this area while growing skills in that area throughout a career?
Well, I think you're being way too kind, so I wouldn't necessarily say any of the things you just
You're
described,
being
but I will
you're
describe,
being way too modest. So go ahead.
at least what I try to do. I think first and foremost is you got to remain curious. And so the folks I most admire, Paul Batalman being one of those, have remained insatiably curious their whole careers, right?
Yeah.
They never feel like they've reached the end of a destination. They're always on that kind of continued journey. I think that's critically important.
Every system is perfectly designed to give you
Yes,
exactly
one of
the
my
results
favorite
you're
quotes of
getting.
all
It's my
time, right?
favorite. Yeah, yeah.
And so, I think recognizing that we're always on this learning journey, and I think embracing that it's okay, and that being, just honest about your mistakes, when those happen. And I think also recognizing what you said earlier, I'm not the expert in a lot of stuff, and so this is where you need to seek others to help you get better, or at least have an understanding. So when you're making strategic decisions, you have at least, as you point out, the ability to ask the right questions, or to at least think about where you want to guide things. And so I think it's that kind of co-production piece that we talked about earlier. I think is really critical, and for me, it's just part of the fun. I find collaborating to me brings joy. I wanna have those conversations, right? I wanna be able to explore stuff. I want to be able to take on this kinda challenging, because I think that's where the fun in the work is. I have a feeling that you don't find a whole lot of joy, like, just checking off the box every day, right? If it's the same thing, it's like it's the other stuff, the creativity stuff that I think is what's important to keep me going. Yeah, I'm just about to turn 67, and so I don't ever want to reach the point where I say, like, "Yep, I'm good." I've reached the end of I mean, because I think that's ridiculous, because look how much things are
I'm as
changing, how
good as I'll
quickly.
ever get.
Yeah. Well, that's what somebody said to me when I
What?
finished my chief residency. "Eric, this is as smart as you're ever gonna be. How does it feel?" And I'm like, "Are you telling me this is as good
Terrible.
as it
Feels
gets?
terrible.
Oh, good heavens, there's so much I don't know, you gotta be kidding me."
Oh my
But I
gosh.
literally had a faculty member, who I love, by the way, literally say that to me, and I'm like, "Oh, good heavens, no."
My first response would be, "Oh, I'm so sorry for you."
Right?
It's like the old
Kinda like,
Springsteen song about glory years, right? You're back in high
yeah, well,
school,
it's
and
that
that's as good as
mindset,
it
because
ever
I had
was,
so much time as a chief, because, like, I presented a morning report every day, so I'm reading
You
like
do. To be fair,
crazy.
that's where you were talking about, like, getting better at an exponential
Oh,
rate.
that year was
That's
amazing
what
in that
chief
regard,
resident
just
year
because of,
does.
yeah, what I was
But that
doing.
that doesn't mean it
No,
flattens,
not even
It might the
close.
slope changes, yes,
Yeah, I
but
went back and forth for a while between being in a military, a healthcare system, and then the civilian side, when I was going back and forth between Yale. And I gotta tell you, like, every time I made that transition, there was an intense period of relearning, because it gets
yes.
back to the context question, who I'm caring for, what my resources are, and so forth, were very different in those environments. And so, the idea that I could just run that simple playbook would be crazy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So we're running up on time.
Yeah.
Last parting shots for folks from beginning of medical school to later in their career. What advice do you have for doctors today?
I think I would just embrace what you're really trying to promote through this whole project is seek out leadership training and opportunities, right? Always seek to get better. Understand that what you do as a leadership implication every single day you're caring for a patient and use that as one of your really critical lens to help you always get better.
Awesome. Dr. Eric Holmboe, thank you very much for your time. And
Thank you.
we look forward to getting this published and people get to listen.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you today, Leanne.
This has been All Physicians Lead. We can all be better leaders, and our teammates and patients will be the beneficiaries. Go to allphysicianslead.com to unlock your potential, sharpen your impact, and elevate your journey. All Physicians Lead with Dr. Leon Morse is a production of Forbes Books.